Before the presentation, I'd like to make aware that this is a hypothetical situation for an educational purpose. Hi, my name is Jacob Lloyd. I'm an environmental health specialist with the Arkansiana Department of Health, and today I'd like to present to the Department of Health an investigation proposal to further inquire about a cancer cluster in Grover and its possible association with a nearby mill. And please forgive me, I have a little bit of a sinus infection right now if I sound nasally. This is a list of questions that I'd like to cover today. First, I'd like to refresh the topic of what a cancer cluster is, and how do we differentiate between the normal occurrence of cancer and an occurrence that is higher due to factors outside of chance. Then, I'd like to discuss how to use a sampling plan to direct the investigation and to further our knowledge base about what the residents are experiencing. Following up on that point, I'd like to talk about the reasoning behind a causal association between the factory and what current evidence suggests about the risk of cancer when being exposed to pollutants emitted from the factory and other factories that are similar to paper mills. And of course, I would like to talk about how an investigation should be undertaken. This will include how to gather data from the residents and then how we can determine if data shows a statistically significant amount of cases. Then, if the rate of cancer is significant, how we would study the local environment to see if levels of these contaminants are higher than normal. Next, I'd like to discuss how to determine if we should continue the investigation, since we can save valuable resources if one is not needed, such as time and money. After this point, I'd like to discuss communication strategies with the residents of Grover as well. If a full-scale investigation is needed, I'd like to cover how we implement testing and specifically what needs to be sampled to procure the appropriate data. Finally, we can determine if there is an association. And I'd like to further touch on how we can report our findings to the residents of Grover in order for them to reduce the risk of exposure, and additionally, what to do if they have been exposed. So firstly, what is a cancer cluster? It's a term to refer to multiple instances of cancer in a defined population that all have remarkably similar types of cancer and timeframes of detection. It's difficult to determine if a cancer cluster is actually present. This is mainly due to lack of information or evidence that doesn't point to similar etiologies, such as different types of cancer or lifestyle factors that are disregarded by the concerned population, such as smoking. However, it's still important to look into these occurrences because they could lead to the identification of harmful chemicals that previously weren't considered a threat. Using this methodology, we've been able to identify many chemicals that previously weren't considered a threat, and so each case should be taken seriously. The first thing that we would need to do in this neighborhood would be to evaluate the population by utilizing a sampling plan. That would give valuable background information to determine if the reported cases are indeed a cancer cluster. Additionally, it would give clues to help lead the investigation. Most importantly, we would need basic biological data such as the type of cancer, date of diagnosis, how long they have lived in the neighborhood, and where they've heard reports of new cases. Additional information that could help the investigation would be how much time the residents spend in the waterways, if they've consumed the water or smelled the factory emissions, and if they experience any other symptoms, such as nausea or headaches. This could be done by mailing questionnaires or calling the residents directly and explaining that we're conducting an investigation about the reported cancer cluster. While the reports of the residents are important, we should also explore the available scientific literature. Paper mills have been shown to emit hundreds of chemicals, with the majority of those being chlorinated hydrocarbons. Some, such as 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, or TCDD for short, have been shown to be carcinogenic in humans, while many others have supporting evidence for being carcinogenic in animal studies. One of the main airborne toxins emitted from these types of mills is chloroform. In addition to being airborne, it readily dissolves in water, which could contribute to the toxicity of the water supply in the area. This could also lead to bioaccumulation if any food sources utilize the nearby water supply, such as agriculture. Some symptoms of chloroform exposure would be headaches and nausea for 990 parts per million, which exceeds the recommended 50 parts per million for occupational exposure. That's the reasoning behind the qualitative aspect of the questionnaire as well. It could help point the investigation to look into times or locations where residents experienced more of these symptoms during possible high exposure events, such as when they could smell the mill or when near or on the water. Although given the available evidence, it might seem that the mill is surely to blame for the residents' problems, we need to be sure before we move forward with a full-scale investigation. The full-scale investigation would require much more resources than what is already required, so we really need to be sure on this step. We first have to evaluate the questionnaires to see if they show correlating cancer diagnoses and timeframes. Additionally, we have to make sure that the levels that they are experiencing are not just the baseline averages that are expected. We can use cancer registries to compare their numbers with the national averages. And this can further be a more complicated step because we have to look into the residents' lives to discern if the cancers being experienced are actually due to the current exposure, or could it be due to past lifestyle characteristics or events such as living in another environment with high level of carcinogens, or like previously mentioned, smoking. Additionally, our population has been changing over time from residents immigrating or exiting the study area, so a well-defined population is hardly what we will find. Regardless of whether an investigation is warranted or not, we have to communicate our decision with the residents. If no investigation is needed, then I would recommend that we distribute information pamphlets to all the residents in the neighborhood. And additionally, I would like to host a meeting with the residents to inform them in person and to answer any questions about why it was not conducted. However, if an investigation is warranted, then the residents should be given information about why we believe the mill might be the cause, and they should have information about what we are going to sample and how. I would also like to have a meeting with the residents for this scenario to explain any further questions about what we would do next and what would be involved with sampling the surrounding area. Presuming that we move forward with the investigation, we would need assistance from other organizations such as the EPA. We should collect samples from the waterways, air, and soil in the neighborhood to determine if the levels of the chemicals found are higher than the recommended limits. These samples should be taken at multiple times. This would account for changes in the factory's production patterns or in weather changes. And after our ecological investigation is complete, we can then examine our data to see if the residents have been experiencing higher levels of exposure to the toxic chemicals and if they can be traced to the factory. Additionally, we should communicate with residents what to do if they've been exposed, and we should help to organize community cancer screenings. If there is no indication that there is a causal association, we should still provide resources for medical counseling to ease concerns about cancer and to provide more information about the causes of cancer. Finally, I'd like to just reiterate some of the main points, so I included a summary. We first described what a cancer cluster is and how the residents of Grover might be exhibiting a cluster. We discussed why the paper mill might be the cause given the available scientific evidence and the chemicals emitted from such mills. Then we went over how to perform an in-depth investigation after a common etiology was determined. Finally, we discussed how our findings should be reported and what the residents should do given the results. While looking into the case of Grover, I believe it is our duty to investigate these claims as environmental health specialists, and I hope that you are able to reach the same conclusion given the information provided today. This is a list of my references. And finally, I'd like to ask if there are any questions that may have come up during the presentation. And finally, I'd like to thank the health department for their time, and especially my boss for listening. Thanks.